Hey, before I get into the talk today, I want to paint a picture for you. I just want to give you a snapshot of like the timeline of the Old Testament. Have you ever seen anything like that? Of like what really happened? And we're not going to get like real in depth, and I don't want us to spend a whole lot of time here. I want us to get lost here, but I just want us to take like a 30,000-foot view of what the Old Testament looks like, okay? And I think that's going to help us with the talk today. And many of this stuff y'all might know. Maybe it's new for you, but I think it's gonna set us up nice for exactly what we're talking about leading up to the birth of Jesus. Okay, so we go all the way back to the book of Genesis. That's the first book of the Bible, and we meet a man by the name of Abraham. And Abraham, God comes to Abraham, and He gives Abraham a promise. He says, "Abraham, the whole world is going to be blessed by you, the whole world, and you are going to have a land, and we'll call it a promised land." We'll call it a promised land, right? And that is the introduction of the promises that God gives to Abraham. And we read through Genesis, and Genesis is an awesome book, and you should read it. And we get to Exodus, and when we get to Exodus, we meet a man by the name of Moses. And at this point, they have not entered into the promised land. In fact, the Jews, this nation of Israel, before they even become a nation, the Jews. They're in bondage, actually. They're in slavery, and they're in slavery under the king Pharaoh, under Egypt, which is like the world power of that day. And y'all know the story. Moses says, "Pharaoh, let my people go." And Pharaoh's like, "All right, you can go." And then they're like, "I don't want you to go." And so they chase them through the Red Sea, and the Red Sea opens up, and Moses leads them through the wilderness for 40 years. And right before they get into the promised land that God had promised Abraham, Moses dies, and there's a guy named Joshua who follows right after Moses, and Joshua leads them into the promised land. So we tracking? Y'all with me so far? Y'all with me so far? And Sandra, let's go ahead and throw up that the next slide up there. Y'all probably can't even read the words are small, but this is just kind of a big overview, 30,000-foot view of what the Old Testament looks like, right? So you see where it splits? We're before it splits, all right? So Joshua has led the nation of Israel into the promised land, and there's not really a government set up. They really don't have a government set up, so they have what's called judges, and they just literally have like men and women specified by the nation that are just kind of like that are judging the nation, but it doesn't really work for them. Like they just kind of, they go through these cycles of ups and downs, and it doesn't really work for them. And finally, the people say, "We need a king. We need a king." Right? They're in the promised land, but they need a king. And God says, "Okay, you can have a king." And the very first king that the nation of Israel ever had, and we read this in the Old Testament, is a man by the name of Saul. And Saul ruled Israel for 40 years. But after Saul, y'all know who was after Saul? That's right. After Saul, and we read this story in 1 Kings, after Saul was probably the greatest king the nation of Israel ever had, and it was King David. And that was like the height of their power of Israel, right? They've been in the promised land. Now this is like, they're the power of the world militarily. David wins incredible battles that we read about in the Old Testament, but they are it, man. And David was a man after God's own heart, and things could not be going better for the nation of Israel. And David had a son, and David's son's name, he had multiple sons, but one of his son's names was Solomon. And the Bible tells us that Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, and after David had died, Solomon became king of the nation of Israel. And remember, they're at the height of their power. They're at the height of their power. Things could not be going better for Israel. And at the height of their power, Israel misconstrued the blessings of God. And they take it as favoritism, and they take it as entitlement. And really, the nation had become indifferent to God, and they settled into this kind of spiritual exile. And while Solomon had the reins of the nation of Israel, the nation actually splits into two. And you can see it right here on the chart. We have the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, and then we have the southern kingdom, which is called Judah. And you can see the northern kingdom just kind of ends, right? And in around 720, 722 BC, the northern kingdom was dispersed by the world power of that day, which was the Assyrians. And you don't really hear about the northern kingdom anymore. And the Bible follows the southern kingdom, which they call Judah, and Judah would eventually go into exile, and they would eventually be exiled by the Babylonians, who were the world power of that day. But before they were invaded, and we're talking about the southern kingdom now, before they were invaded and taken into exile, there were prophets that were written. In fact, we read these prophets in the Old Testament. It's probably names that you have a hard time pronouncing how the heck you say it, and you're not really sure what they're talking about. But these prophets would come into the city of Jerusalem, prophets like Amos and prophets like Nahum and Haggai and Malachi and Habakkuk and Zephaniah. They would come racing into the city of Jerusalem saying, the way that you're living isn't right. It's not right. It is not right. Your hearts have turned away from God. They would start calling out the empire. They would start calling out these kings, and they would say, what you are doing is not right. Turn back to God. Turn back to God. But they were exiled nonetheless. So we had this promised land that was given to Abraham that the nation of Israel would eventually go into because it was promised to them. And here they are. They have been exiled out of their own land. They've been exiled out of their own land. And in exile, these same prophets who wrote warnings to them saying, turn your hearts back to God. After they were in exile, the prophets began to write about something else, and they began to write about this one that was coming. They would say another leader is coming, and when they talked about another leader, their hearts harkened back to Moses when Moses led them out of bondage in Egypt, and the prophets would say another leader like that is coming. And then the prophets would say that there's going to be a seed of David that's going to come. And when a Jew would hear seed of David, just think about this. Think about this. Try to put your mind like you're an ancient Jew and you're reading these prophets. And they would say a seed of David is coming. Well, the last seed of David was Solomon, and that didn't work out too well. That didn't work out too well. But they said it's not going to be like Solomon who led us astray, but it's going to be another person who would use his power properly. It's going to be one who cared for the poor and one who cared for the oppressed and one who would never use his power to coerce others, but they'd use it for good. And this would be the son of David that would use his power purely and use his power properly. In Isaiah, we read Isaiah, and he would write, there's going to be another one, and he's going to be a prince. He's going to be a prince of peace. And this powerful leader and ruler would be a servant. And Isaiah said that he would have the Spirit of God on him, and he would announce good news to the poor. In fact, Isaiah records God saying prophetically, see, my servant will act wisely. Who else was wise? Who had wisdom? Solomon? Well, how'd that work out last time? See, when a Jew would read that, their minds would think back to the other seed of David, Solomon, who did not act wisely. But Isaiah says, this servant's going to act wisely. And what started as predictions about an earthly ruler exploded into an expectation of this servant, this divinely sent servant who would, in some powerful new way, rule forever. And they weren't really sure about it. And then that's kind of how the Old Testament ends. That's kind of it, right? They've got all these promises. They've got all these expectations. And it just kind of ends there, right? The Jews would eventually go back into the city of Jerusalem, and you read books like Nehemiah, and they begin to build walls, and all that begins to take place. But it's different now, and when they read these prophets, these promises, these expectations, this coming something, and then they just kind of get left there, just kind of hanging on, and you finish the Old Testament, and you're not really sure what just happened, and you're not really sure where it's going or who's coming. And this group of people who lost it all, they began asking these questions. What if we had it all back? What if we could do this all over again? What would we do differently? What if there was a child that actually was born, a son that was given? What if the government really could rest upon his shoulders? What if David had another son? And they began asking these questions, hoping that in some way they would hear an answer from God. And instead, do you know what they get? They get silence. You can kind of see it. You see the cross over there on the way right, and before that you see the birth of Christ. And then there's this little gap that says the silent years. And it's because the the Jews, the nation of Israel, they didn't hear a word from God for 400 years. Now, you just think about that for a minute. You just think about that. The gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament spans about 400 or 450 years, and God gave no word, nothing, silence. 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 400 years of silence. You know, silence is something that most of us aren't real comfortable with. And many times we equate silence with something being wrong. And if y'all are like me, I like rush to fill the silence. I rush to feel it. And we feel it in all different kinds of ways. We feel it with TV a lot of times. We feel the silence with TV. And or we feel it with the radio or talk radio, some of us. Or we feel it with, we try to fill it with maybe relationships that are toxic for us, but it's just because we can't stand the silence. Like sometimes there'll be nothing going on, I'll take my cell phone out, I'll turn it on, and then I'll immediately turn it back off. Is that not the weirdest thing? Am I the only person who does that? I see y'all smiling because I know y'all do it too. It's like I wasn't going to check anything, there was silence. I needed to do something, so I just turned my phone off, and then I turn it right back. But we do that, don't we? And I think we do all of this because we really don't do well with silence. And I'm not sure about all of you, but I know that there have been times in my life where I have cried out to God. I've either physically cried out to God or just in my heart I have been crying out to God, wanting something, like an answer, just something, and I don't get anything, actually. I get nothing. Nothing. I don't get a response. I don't get an answer, just nothing. Absolutely silence. And maybe you're like me where I have prayed at times and I have felt so let down, so hurt that I've prayed, God, like, give me something, anything. Like, where are you? I know once specifically in my life, I was praying for my own personal demons that I dealt with, my own personal deliverance, and since then, God has rescued me, and I thank Him for that. But when I look back, going through it, I was thinking, God, I was crying out to you, and in the middle of that, I didn't feel anything. Like I got nothing. I felt silence. It's like, you got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me. Another time, specifically in my life, was with my wife, my family, and I was praying for direction of where we should go, what we should do, what I should be doing. Oh, we're about to have a baby. Like, I don't have a job. Like, what are we doing? What are we doing? And in the middle of that, I felt nothing. I got nothing. Silence, silence, silence. Have y'all felt that before? Have y'all felt that? I bet we all have. And the funny thing is that the times when God has seemed most silent in my life, and there have been times, it's like all of a sudden, out of the blue, I begin to get a clear picture of where God is leading me, and it comes in the most random ways. I'll get a phone call that I wasn't expecting to get, and it's good news, and I didn't expect to get that, but I just got it. Or maybe if I was looking for a job, or maybe this has happened to some of you, you look for a job and you're not even planning on interviewing anywhere, but you get a phone call and you get this interview, and it's like, wow, I didn't even see that. I didn't even see that coming. Or maybe a person will come into your life that you didn't even expect. Like you didn't even see it coming, but you didn't even know them maybe a week or 2 weeks ago or a month ago, but finally you begin to build a relationship with them and they're just perfect for you. Maybe you can minister and bless them in some kind of way, or maybe they bless you in some kind of way and you didn't see it coming, but it begins to change you, and it just so happens that it seems like it comes out of the blue. A door opens for you that you did not see opening, and it happens. It happens. When I think about the Christmas story, I think I love the Christmas trees, and I love I love giving gifts. That's awesome. That's great. But when I think about the Christmas story, I don't think about all of that. I think about the world finding out who God is and what God is about when He seems so silent. And that's what I want to hang our hats on today. That's what I want to hang our hats on today. Finding God when He seems silent. If you got a pen, write down some notes with me. When we think about the Christmas story and we think about our own lives and we think about those times when God has seemed so silent, write this down. Jesus comes at the right time. Jesus comes at the right time. Comes at the right time. Galatians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul says this. He says, "But when the right time came, God sent His Son, born of a woman, subject to the law. Now listen to this. This is fascinating to me. I read this earlier. I found this earlier. It says, if Jesus were born a century earlier, just think about this. If Jesus were born a century earlier, He would have lived in a time of political unrest, His people fighting among themselves for power among the Jews, and this was happening about 100 years before Jesus was born. Furthermore, the apostles would not have been nearly as capable of carrying the gospel throughout the world, because 100 years before Jesus was born, the Roman Empire was really young. It really hadn't established really stability. It hadn't built roads, which the Roman Empire was most famous for, was roads that really connected that part of the world. And the apostles wouldn't have been able to carry out the gospel. Well, when Jesus was born, it was during a time called the Pax Romana. It was this peaceful time in the Roman Empire. The Romans weren't at war with anyone, and it's the time known as the Pax Romana. And this is when Jesus was born. Furthermore, the world already spoke Greek, basically as the international business language. We speak English today, even across the world. If you want to, that's kind of the language of money. Back in Jesus' day, Greek was the language of money, and that was thanks in part to Alexander the Great, who began to Hellenize the world centuries before Jesus was born. So by the time Jesus was born, the entire world knew how to speak Greek, which is interesting because the New Testament was written basically in Greek. So if someone needed to send a letter, maybe a gospel called Mark or Luke or John, they wanted to send this letter to other parts of the world so that people could read and learn about Jesus. They could do that because everybody read Greek. Everybody did. Everybody read Greek. If Jesus were born a century after He was born, there would be no Jewish state for Him to live in, because by 100 years after Jesus was born, the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., right? The temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. after Jesus, and the Jews were expelled in 70 A.D. They're also expelled again in 135 A.D. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say, Jesus and like this Christian movement, this community of followers that began to expand and just blow up, it happened at the right time. It happened at the right time, and it kind of makes you think, like behind all of that, maybe God had something to do with something. You think? There was 400 years of silence from God before Jesus was born, and yet all of these events were taking place. All of these events were taking place, and they aligned at just the right time for Jesus to be born. I hate waiting, like for anything. Y'all like me? Y'all hate waiting? I hate it, man. I hate it. I hate going to the doctor's office. I hate, like, if it's more than a minute in the microwave, like that's forget about it. Forget about it. Because to me, waiting is demoralizing. Like it's a waste of time. It's agonizing to me, and I get annoyed and aggravated. And if you're like me, I just would rather, it's easier just to give up and just move on and forget about it, right? And we do that in a lot of different ways, and I do it. I'm guilty of as anybody here, because even dreams that we have, it's like, you know, you can't. I feel like you can't wait on a dream forever, so you just give up on it at some point and move on to something else. Or people, you look at people maybe that are close to you, and you say, "Oh, that's just a drug addict. They ain't never going to change," and you give up on them. You give up on them. Someone struggles with depression, you say, "Man, I just wish they'd snap out of it." And you just give up on them. You give up on them. But you understand, Jesus doesn't work like that. Y'all know that? Jesus doesn't give up on people. We read the Christmas story, and it's beautiful. It's the story of His birth, and that's all great. But Jesus, the story of Jesus doesn't end there. The story of Jesus, when He's in His earthly ministry, and he sees people like a woman at the well who'd been married 5 times, and who really had been an outcast of her society. She comes to Him, and Jesus doesn't give up on her. In fact, He changes her heart. We hear stories about Zacchaeus, who was a crook, man. He stole from the Jews. He was a Jew who worked for Rome. He was a traitor. People hated him. And yet Jesus would look at people like him, and He'd say, "Zacchaeus, come down. I'm going to stay at your house today, not because I have to, but because I want to. I want to change your heart. I want to change your life people have given up on you. I haven't. I'm going to come to your house today. Peter, his closest friend, would deny him 3 times right before his crucifixion. And that is like, I can't imagine anything worse than that, than saying, I don't even know who you are. That's like spitting in somebody's face. I can't imagine it being worse than that. And Peter did it 3 times. And Jesus looked at Peter and he said, Peter, do you love me? And Peter's like, yes, God, yes. He's like, then feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. And Peter would become one of the church leaders because he didn't give up on them. He loved people. He forgave people. And he waited on God to work. And over time, God changed all these people's lives. And I bet if we were honest, every one of us could tell about some time or some thing that we wrestled with, and maybe we have prayed and asked God for an answer, and we just don't feel like we're getting an answer, or maybe it took years. Maybe you're still waiting for it, and you just hear silence. It just feels like it's taken forever. You don't hear anything. Give God time to work. Can I just encourage all of us? Give God time to work. Pastor Bishop Dale Bronner, he wrote this. He says, God never hurries. He's eternal. God never loses control. God never panics. God has a purpose in every delay. If it dies in the process, God can raise it. If it falls apart, God can put it back together. If it walks away from you, God can bring someone better in their place. God is never left scratching his head wondering, what am I going to do now? Ever, ever, ever. And y'all, when God seems silent, he might just be aligning the stars for you. And then out of the blue, Jesus shows up at the right time. Second thing, write this down. Finding God when he seems so silent. Jesus, when we think of the Christmas story, he comes to the right place. Jesus comes to the right place. Luke chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 say this. All returned to their own ancestral towns to register for this census. Caesar Augustus had decreed a census, so all of the males had to go back to their hometown. And so this is the reason they were doing this. And because Joseph was a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea. That was David's ancient home, interestingly enough. He traveled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee. And we read that story, or we read that verse in the Bible and think that's great. This is what it says in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. This is an Old Testament prophet, and he says these words. He says, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, are only a small village in Judah, and yet a ruler of Israel will come from you, one whose origins are from a distant past. That's awesome, isn't it? Like that was written, I don't know, 400, probably 500, 550 years before Jesus was born. And God was fulfilling the prophecies exactly the way he promised it. There's a book, I met this guy one time, his name's Josh McDowell, great writer, real big, probably 25 years ago maybe, and he's kind of an older gentleman now. But he wrote this book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And he says in that book that Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies from the Old Testament. 300. That's awesome. 300 prophecies from the Old Testament are fulfilled, we read, in Jesus. And one of these prophecies we see here that Jesus was born in the birthplace of David, Israel's greatest king. And I don't know why that it does this to me, but I'm just an optimist. Like, I just always try to look at the glass half full. You ask my wife, she gets so mad at me sometimes, and I just think, man, I'm sorry. That's just the way I'm wired. I just think things are going to work out. They're going to work out. I don't know how they're going to work out, but they're going to work out. And y'all, it's not always the best advice, but this Christmas, my prayer is that for all of us, maybe you're not an optimistic person, just how you are, but this Christmas, my prayer is that we just all are shamelessly optimistic. We're shamelessly optimistic. That whatever life has given us so far, and for some of us, life has been great. We've had ups, we've had downs. For some of us, life has not been so great. Didn't get the right family. Weren't born into the right family. Can't seem to catch a break. But whatever life has given us so far, that I just believe this. I believe Jesus is in the midst of where we are. It reminds me of a story. Maybe you've heard this story. There once was a little boy, And he was a shameless optimist. He just believed in everything. He always saw the good in everything. And this young boy, he just would find good in every circumstance that life threw his way. And like his little league football team lost their league playoff game, and the boy reminded everybody that they don't need to be upset because they got all the guys coming back next year. They're going to be better next year, and he just was optimistic about that. And he said, "We're going to be better. We'll beat them next year." And it didn't matter what happened. This boy would never lose his spirit of optimism, and he would always find the silver lining in the clouds some way, somehow. But he was so optimistic, actually, that his parents began to worry about him. And they thought, you know what, life actually gets tough at some point, and it's going to present challenges to him. And he needs to learn how to accept that. All right? He needs to learn how to accept that. And this boy, it was Christmas time, and he wanted a pony for Christmas. All he wanted, he just wanted a pony. He believed that every morning he was going to wake up, and there was going to be a pony in his front yard. And he just believed it with all his heart. And he would pray every night that when Christmas morning came, there was going to be a pony in the front yard. And his parents thought that perhaps that this was going to be the time that they could teach their kid a valuable life lesson about what it means to live through this life. And so they ordered a truckload of horse manure, and they piled it up in front of their yard on Christmas Eve late at night. And the next morning, when the little boy woke up, he went outside, and he just knew there was going to be a pony outside. And instead, he finds a big pile of horse manure. And he ran out to that horse manure. He scrambled up to the top of it, and he began digging with his bare hands. And he just was all up in the horse manure, and he was having the best time. And his parents were like, "What in the world are you doing?" And he was grinning ear to ear, and he replied, "With all this horse crap, there's got to be a pony in there somewhere," and he just was going to dig till he found it. I think that's the kind of life that's the way I want to live this Christmas. That's the way I want to live this Christmas. You know, God's not afraid of messiness, and that's something that I think gets missed in the Christmas season because it's so. We just, we make it look real pretty, and it was just great, and I love it's all nice, but God's not afraid of a messy life, and Dad's going to he's going to talk about that in a few weeks, and I'm excited about that, and so we won't spend a whole lot of time there, but he's not. That Jesus really knows the greatest need in your life, and he meets us there. That's where he meets us. He shows up at the right place. You go through depression, Jesus meets you in the midst of that. You struggle with addictions, Jesus meets you in the midst of that. You struggle with relationship problems, boyfriend, girlfriend, or husband or wife, or Jesus meets us in the midst of our relationships. I believe that. And he shows up at the right place. 3, write this down. When God seems silent for me, Jesus comes the right way. Comes in the right way. Luke chapter 2 says this. It says, "And while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born, and she gave birth to her first child, a son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no available lodging for them." And what can get lost in the birth story of Jesus in this Christmas time, I think, is the unexpected way that God enters into the world. Y'all know God could have come any way he wanted to. He could have come in power. He could have come overthrowing governments. He could have come violently. God could have come violently. He chose not to do that. He could have come with great wealth. He could have come with great power. He could have come any way he wanted to. And yet the Apostle Paul writes this in Philippians chapter 2. Paul says this. He says, "Though he was God, he did not think equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave, and he was born as a human being." You know what else can get lost in the Christmas story? Is the unexpected way that Jesus meets us today. you know, it's one of the greatest life lessons about Jesus that I've ever learned. I actually learned from my brother Ray, who will lead teams of people into Atlanta to give. Actually, doing one soon, but he leads them into Atlanta to give shoes and socks and coats and blankets to the poorest of the poor in Atlanta, and we go to I literally go under bridges to do this. And I remember the first time we ever did this, there was somebody that was with us, and they were making a big deal that we wanted to circle up and pray with every person that we met with. And which sounds like which sounded like a good enough idea, but my brother said, "You know what? We're not going to do that. We're not going to pray with them." I said, "Wait a minute, we're at church. We're a church. That's what we do, right? We pray with people. That's what we do." And he said something so profound. He said, "You know, people who are cold don't need a prayer; they need a blanket." And somehow, basically what he was saying was, in the midst of us giving those things out to people who needed it, that Jesus meets them there. Jesus is in the giving of the blanket. And people who are cold don't need a prayer, they need a blanket. Jesus meets them there. And that's changed me. It's changed me. And what I've discovered is that Jesus meets us in all different sorts of ways. You know, I was raised where you say a prayer and you allow Jesus to come in your heart, and that's kind of how you got to Jesus. But that doesn't work in real life to me. Like that just, as I've gotten older, that doesn't work for me, because I see Jesus in all different sorts of ways now. Yesterday, my wife and we ran a 5K, and it was called the Jungle Cup. It was like a mud run. Y'all ever heard of a mud run? It's like you run a 5K, but it's not just running. Like, you got to go through obstacles. It's like boot camp through this 5K. So needless to say, we were walking pretty early on in this 5K. And the 5K takes you, we were out in Conyers, and it's like the Yellow River's out there, and you had to like wade through the river was part of it. It's freezing cold. And a lot of it's through the woods. You literally are running through the woods and jumping over stuff. But we were, we weren't going to win anyways. But we were just walking. And there were literally times during the race where there was nobody around. No, like an earshot. Like you could yell out, there wasn't anybody around you. And it was a pretty day yesterday. And we're just walking. And we're just looking at the trees and the colors and the nature. And we were just talking about our lives and just talking about how blessed we were. That, our lives aren't perfect. We don't have $1 million. We don't have all of that. But we just got good people around us, and we got a healthy son, and we got each other, and that we just are blessed folks. We're blessed folks. And y'all, we couldn't have been farther away from the walls of a church. And yet Jesus was there, I believe. We couldn't have been farther away from the walls of a church. And Jesus met us there. You just felt the Spirit. Friday night, we went out to a restaurant with some friends of ours to celebrate Rachel's birthday, which is today. So y'all be sure you tell her happy birthday. She's 35 years old and couldn't be more prettier. I'm just teasing, that ain't her age. But we went out to a restaurant with some friends, and we just had a blast, man. We had a good time. We were up in Atlanta, and we just sat around, and we told old stories. And some new stories, and we just laughed. It just was good company, and we told embarrassing stories. And y'all wouldn't think a redhead would be able to turn red, but boy, she can turn red. And we just had a good time. We were just among friends. And y'all know what I'm talking about. You've been around your friends, and there's just a vibe amongst those people. Or another way to say it, there's like a spirit that's in the midst of the people there, of your friends. And I believe Jesus meets us there. And I don't think we mentioned the name Jesus once, but he was there. He was there. We had a blast. So Jesus comes to us, I believe, in our interactions with other people, with our exchanges, with our people at work, with our wives, with our husbands, with our co-workers, with our neighbors. And He comes to us, y'all, in our joys when we're on the mountaintop, and Jesus comes to us in our sorrows. He comes to us when we're alone. He comes to us when we're amongst all the noise. He comes to us when we have made a mess of things. And He doesn't beat us over the head with the Bible. He just simply reminds us that God is not silent in our lives. In fact, in our lives, the final word has already been spoken. The final word on our life has already been spoken. And it's when Jesus said, it's finished, it's finished. And with Christmas, y'all, comes a birth, but with Jesus comes a resurrection. And I believe that. And if God seems to be silent to you this Christmas, my prayer is that we look past all the noise, we look past all of the distractions to find out really in our lives Jesus has been here amongst us the entire time. And when we discover that, it's like finding something out of the blue. And man, I'm telling you, our lives begin to be changed. And we begin to see Christmas a brand new way. And I believe that's what makes the world better. That's what makes the world better. Would you bow your heads and would you pray with me? God, we love you so much. And we can get lost in so many different ways, especially during the Christmas season when we're just inundated with advertisements and commercials and stress. And in all of that, God, we miss you. We miss you. And my prayer is that this church, this community, everybody here, that when we think about Christmas, we think about not just a baby entering into the world, but the Savior of the universe, the Son of God, Jesus, who would grow up to be a man and who would grow up to teach us things about life, and who would look at the outcast, the poorest of the poor, and He would give them hope, and He would challenge them, and He would take them to another level. God, that's what our prayer is this Christmas. That we got hope, man, we got hope. That's what Christmas is about. God, that when you seem silent in our lives, God, may we know that you have been in the midst of us this whole time. You've been among us the whole time, and forgive us when we miss you. But may our hearts and our spirits and our minds and our lives, may they know that you are real, that you are as real today as you were 2,000 years ago when you were born in a manger. You are amongst us right now, God. And when we struggle with life, with the 9 to 5, with the bills, with the pills, with the relationships that have gone awry, or the relationships that are just everyday life, that you are amongst us. You're in the midst of us, and we can find you in all different kinds of ways, but it is Jesus. It is Jesus who has the power to change. Now, we love you so much. Our hearts be open to whatever you are leading us this Christmas. And may the Village Church be a vessel for good news to a dying world. We love you, oh God, and we pray these things in the powerful name of Jesus. Amen.